When we develop huge applications, they are divided into modules. And each of these modules will be implemented as 4 layers in Java EE applications, starting with data access layer, services layer, presentation layer, and integration layer. No matter how many Java EE projects you will work on, you will come across all of these layers or at least some of these layers depending on the requirements. Starting with data access layer, which is a independent layer because it does not depend on any other layer. It is responsible for performing the CRUD operations, create, read, update, and delete operations against a data store. The services provided by the data access layer are used by the services layer. This is where all our business logic or application logic will reside. The services provided by the services layer are used by the presentation layer classes and interfaces, as well as the integration layer classes and interfaces. The presentation layer, as the name itself says, is responsible for generating the user interface. This is what the end user will see. The integration layer, on the other hand, is responsible for allowing our application to access other applications in the organization or third-party applications. Or the integration layer can also be used by other applications to access our application. So typically an integration layer is made up of web services. So all these layers, data access layer, service layer, presentation layer, integration layer, are made up of Java interfaces and classes that we create. So there are 10 or 9 plus 1 important interfaces and classes that fall across these layers, starting with model class or an entity class. This class represents our domain model. This does not fall under any of these layers. We can consider it under the data access layer, but this is usually considered as a separate class that will be used across these layers. It represents the data or the model or the domain of our application. Once we have the model class, we can create the data access layer interface. So we'll be creating the very first interface in the data access layer, wherein we'll define all the CRUD operations, save, read, update, delete. And then we'll implement that interface. So always code to interfaces, implement that interface called DAO IMPL. This is a class that implements this interface. Once we have the data access layer, we create a services layer interface and define the operations in there, and then create a services implementation class which will implement this interface. This services impl will in turn use the services provided by the DAO. The sixth and important piece is the controller class. In the Spring MVC world, a controller class is responsible for generating the UI. So the controller will make use of the services provided by the services layer, and it will generate a UI for us. So these are the 6 important interfaces and classes. Here we have 2 interfaces, rest all are classes. The 7th one are utility classes. These classes, as we will create in lectures later on, are responsible for performing operations across these layers. We can use these utility classes for performing special operations across these layers. 8th, validator classes. As the name itself says, we create these classes to validate the data, usually that comes in from the user and that goes back to the user. Special kind of classes. The 9th class that we create are service providers or service consumers. Usually these are web services. The integration layer is made up of web services, mostly RESTful services, as we will see. So our application can be a service provider so that other applications can access our application through this layer, or in some cases, it can even access other applications by becoming a service consumer, or it can be both a service provider and a consumer. Last but not the least, 9 plus 1 or the 10th class is a special view that we create for representing the data as Excel sheet, PDF, etc. So that is the reason I am calling it 9 plus 1 instead of 10, because this is a special view class which we create in few cases where we want to generate Excel sheets, PDFs, or a special view of our data. So to summarize, there are 4 layers: data access, service, presentation, and integration. And the interfaces and classes that make up these 4 layers are 10 of them mainly, starting with the data access layer, DAO and impl, services layer, interface and impl, the controller class, the model class, which was the first one to start with, then the utility classes, validator classes, service providers and service consumers for the integration layer, and finally a special view which will be used in some cases.